Hello and welcome to episode 239 of the 21st Century Work-Life podcast, where we talk about leading remote teams, online collaboration, and working in distributed organizations. This podcast is brought to you by Virtual Not Distant, where we help managers and teams transition to an office-optional approach. Find out everything we do over at virtualnotdistant.com and check out our content, including blog posts and the show notes to all our podcast episodes. It's great to have you here. If we haven't met before, my name is Pilar Orti, and I'm the director of Virtual Not Distant. And in today's episode, it's just me again. I thought I'd share with you something I've been working on, and it's the relationship, get ready, between task interdependence and visible teamwork practices. So we might get a little bit technical, but in essence, it's about choosing your online communication and collaboration methods in a way that suits the nature of your tasks, the nature of how your individual tasks are dependent on each other. Because, for example, a team where team members can work independently most of the time without having to wait for someone else to finish their work or without needing any kind of input from another team member, well, they will need different communication processes than a team where everyone is collaborating on a task really, really tightly. So it's about that. I will explain the principles of visible teamwork, which are mainly about adopting asynchronous communication, but we're now calling them flexible communication, but not always, not only async. So before I start, I'd like to thank Teresa Sigilito-Holman because it was from her that I first heard about this concept. And in fact, she was kind enough to have a conversation only yesterday with me about this, a synchronous conversation, which as always has helped me to consolidate my thinking even more. And it's also made me realize that I still need to do some thinking around this. So listeners, thank you for letting me share this idea with you at this point. I will plug Teresa's company and website, interact-global.net. And she has a new book. I think at the moment it's on pre-order, or at least you can sign up to be notified. And it's called Virtual Teams Across Cultures. Guess what that is about? So follow the link in the show notes to find out more about Teresa and the book, which I've had the pleasure to read some kind of draft, a few drafts actually. And I highly recommend it. So also in the show notes, I will stick a link to a blog post we have on the principles of visible teamwork. So I'm going to recap them now really quickly, but in case you want to check that out. The principles of visible teamwork, I call them principles, and it's something that I've observed that is different to collaboration online than it might be if we were together in the office all the time. Although, of course, even when we work, you remember those days when we worked in an office all together? We still use technology. So actually, you could argue that these principles can be adopted by any kind of setup of physical distance setup. But in looking at how the practices were different, both from a manager's point of view and a team's point of view, this is what I've come up with. So there's three areas, if you will. One is deliberate communication, which is about having processes that allow us to communicate the information about us as a person that people might not have access to because they're far away from us. And that is usually around availability, context, and mood. The next set is on work visibility, which is again about making some of our work visible. Hurrah! And those are visible workflow, which is about progress of tasks, open conversations, which is about having conversations where every team member that's interested can be involved or at least read. And finally, work visibility, which is about making the work visible, especially knowledge workers having our documents in the cloud so that they are open, which of course has a lot of challenges, but hey-ho, that's everything has challenges. And finally, planned spontaneity, which really looks at the concepts of virtual coffee, either as a meeting, which a lot of people have discovered now, or having channels in your collaboration platforms where you can have coffee asynchronously, chit-chat stuff. Meeting in the work, which is about using those features like your avatars in collaboration platforms or in Google Docs, for example, shared documents, using the features where you can see where other people are around and to give you that connection, that spontaneous connection. And also, again, availability. So showing our availability, not just so we can have a meeting or something that's very formal, but also when are you free to have a chat? And interestingly, this last one is mainly about the fact that we now have mobile phones, because if you think back to some of us who used to work in the office, sometimes when we rang a landline, well, either the person was there, and if they were at their landline at work, they were available. But now with mobile phones, there's all sorts of stuff. So anyway, and what I'm realizing is that these systems, which I set up at the beginning to help teams stay aligned and sharing the work, etc., they're also about staying connected. And we know now, after 7 episodes of our series on connection and disconnection in remote teams, which was put together by Bri Kajati from Shield Geo, our new collaborators, we know now that isolation is not just a very real problem in remote teams and distributed organizations, but it's also a complex problem. And how we avoid isolation and disconnection can take many forms. So in some teams, adopting some of the principles of visible teamwork will be about making sure that we're not duplicating work, that we're all in sync in the work, that we're thinking the same way, aligned. But in others, it will be more about staying connected, about learning from each other, about knowing that other people are there to support us. So we need to really know our teams, even within organizations. Even if we adopted these principles in an organization, at a team level, it's going to vary. And depending on what we're trying to solve, we will adopt these principles differently, and we will adopt some of them and not others. But this is what I've realized, that for some teams, the alignment in the work will be more important. And for others, the connection and the informal learning will be more important. And both, of course. So, task interdependence. So this is about looking at the tasks we do, if that's how our work is structured, and how we are dependent on each other. So those that we can do some tasks independently from others, but then there's some that we can't start our work till others are finished because of the sequential nature. And then there'll be those that we can kind of do independently, but we need to be changing and getting feedback, and the nature of the task might change because of what other people are doing. And then we have the ones where we're just doing together, working very tightly on one task. So to be able to implement the right communication systems of visible teamwork, then especially actually around work visibility, we need to understand the type of interdependence between team members. And then this can help you decide the type of processes you can design, the frequency of communication. We don't need to be connected all the time. And also we don't want to lose touch. And also the best type of technology suitable for your team. Don't fall in love with a piece of tech that actually is completely unsuited to your workflow. And if you can only work with what you've got, then make sure it's supporting you. If you look at interdependence of tasks, then the systems of visible teamwork, again, will help you to see whether it's more about coordinating the work or creating a sense of connection. So let's have a look at each in turn. There are 4 types of interdependence. I'm still getting my head around the last 2, the difference, but I think it's becoming clear. So thank you, Teresa. So pooled interdependence is the first type. And when we have this kind of task interdependence in our team, we share the main objective, but not the tasks. So we can get on with our work without affecting anybody else's workflow. Our tasks can run in parallel to each other. So the team's overall work will consist of all these tasks happening at the same time, but not necessarily with much interaction. So in this case, for example, the systems to make the workflow visible are mainly going to be about reminding who is doing what, that other people are doing something, and that we are adding value to something bigger than ourselves. But there's no point in getting too detailed about our workflow if it's not really affecting anyone. And these systems, however, might be more about sharing learning, because as we update our workflow, we might have something that we are learning about the task, or we might be adding bits of information to our workflow information. But there'll be more about creating a sense of connection and avoiding a feeling of isolation in team members. They might also be about accountability to each other. If we want to avoid micromanagement and any kind of either from between team members or manager, or saying, when is this finished? Is it finished? Is it finished? Just have it online, update it there. And if anyone is worried, they can have a look and see what's going on, and red flags can be raised. So that's a very specific way of using a visible workflow. So as team members will need little interaction to do their work, then actually adopting the principles of deliberate communication, which are about what we communicate as a person, so our availability, our mood, and our context. This is, again, going to be more around reminding people that we're there for emotional support than working better together. Because if I'm not really depending on you to complete my task, if I don't really have to work with you on my task, what do I care what mood you're in? Let's face it. However, if we want to build a kind of sense of cohesion, and if we want people to be around for each other, then it is important to share a little bit of that context or personal stuff in a way. Again, very dependent on culture, on all of that, but I hope you get the gist that deliberate communication in that way. So surfacing communication about our person that team members are missing because they can't see us might be more important from a connection and emotional support than really to get on with the work. Then the second type of interdependence is about sequential interdependence, which, as the name suggests, our tasks can be dependent on each other if we need to carry them out in sequence. So until I finish my task, you can start yours. And this kind of dependence tends to be predictable. So, for example, the workflow of this podcast, the 21st Century Work-Life podcast, is made up of small sequential tasks, and they group into different stages. And so each stage is mainly completed by one person. So I provide the audio files and show note materials, links and images. Then Ross takes the audio files, puts the episode together, uploads it to our host, Libsyn, and then Maya creates the show notes, does the quality control on the audio file. And then Ross cannot start his task until I'm done, and Maya can't start. She needs to pick up the chain where he left off. So in a way, I saw this in an article, one person's output becomes another's input, which I like that. You can see here how a visible workflow is quite important, just to say, yeah, I've done this, you can move on. I've done this, now you can go into wherever to pick up the files. And also it's a reminder. I use it as a to-do list for myself. And within this kind of workflow, so if we have sequential interdependence, then individuals need to take responsibility to agree the deadlines with each other. And this is actually where communicating context also becomes important, to know when we need to be flexible or when we need to change things around. And we need to keep a record of the deadlines online. We don't need to be remembering by when someone was said they had done this. Just put it online, forget about it. And also communicating the progress of individual tasks, which if it's something that there's not much to say about the progress rather than if it's done or not, that's all you need to say. So, as I was saying, certain aspects of deliberate communication can become important, like context, any changes in context, because this will warn others that a situation might be becoming unstable and affect our work. We're not machines, as much as we'd like to think that sometimes we can operate like them. So the deliberate communication becomes important. Also, open conversations might become important around questions we might have, lack of information about the tasks, because they might start signaling that there's a little bit of a bumpy ride along the way to completing a task. So again, it's not always quite clear what information might come in handy. And by open conversations, I refer to not talking in closed systems like email, but in places that are more accessible to all the team. And so you can have a conversation with one other person, but instead of having them in a closed system, you have it in the open. And then also if the sequence of tasks is indeed predictable, but the person needs to introduce a change, then this can be communicated clearly. And any conversations around this and why it's happening then need to be made visible. So we don't have to be repeating the same thing. What did you know? When I talked to them, they said, just stick it all in the open conversation. Anyone who's interested can go and have a look. Then reciprocal interdependence, which is, I hope I've understood this one correctly, which is we are doing our tasks and they might be sequential, but in any case, they are needing a little bit of to and froing. So it's not as clear cut as I do this task after you've finished, I get on with it. Actually, I will be affected by what you are doing, but we're still working quite independently from each other. But the input, we're constantly needing more feedback because the nature of our task might change if someone else's task is changing. So you can see how here we need a bit more conversation. We start to work a little bit maybe kind of a cyclical manner, and dependency moves backwards and forwards between us. Sometimes I'm more dependent on what you're doing, sometimes the other way around. So again, so what this then tends to happen is it becomes more important to share our thinking and our learning as we work through our tasks because they might be changing. And also to have conversations in the open when more than one person is involved in a task, again, so that we're constantly sharing information. And of course, whereas pooled interdependence and sequential interdependence, the work might just benefit from all kinds of asynchronous communication. As we start to depend a bit more on each other, then we might start to have higher levels of synchronous communication. So just be aware that if you are doing that, if you're starting to go onto meetings to have conversations or phone calls, then you might want to report back to the rest of the team anything that's important or interesting or relevant. Deliberate communication also becomes important because if we need more frequent, synchronous, real-time touch points with each other, then what we don't want is for someone to feel like they're being constantly interrupted. So do those availability systems where you say, unless something's really urgent this afternoon, please don't tap me on the shoulder online, because I really need to just put my head down and work on this. So that might be important. And then adopting the principles of visible teamwork for these kind of teams will make it easier for team members to catch up with the workflow, and even for team members to swap tasks when needed. Because you might have just distributed the tasks amongst you, not because of specialism, but actually because, preference, or it might be the case that all of you could be doing any of the tasks. If you have really good systems of visible workflow and you've had some open conversations, if you need to jig things around, it's easier. Yeah, there's less explaining, this is what I was doing. Look, it's in that card in Trello. Have a look. If you have any questions, then let me know. So mixture of we're trying to have happier collaboration, more effective collaboration, and more flexible collaboration. Then I've got a note here for myself, also integrated, which is more about working together on a task. Yes, so in addition to reciprocal, we also have a different kind of interdependence, which is integrated, which is, as I understand it, where we're really working together. Now it's not a question of, I kind of need your input and your feedback. Now it's, unless I'm communicating with you quite regularly and in a high quality fashion, then we can't work. So for that, you can see then that visible teamwork becomes more important in certain ways, but actually making time for real-time communication might be more important. So as you see, it's not that easy, but I think that if we start to look at what our team is doing and the kind of tasks, task interdependence, how we are dependent on each other to carry out our work, then we can start to say, okay, well, that is not relevant. That is relevant. We're doing this because we want to achieve connection. We're doing this because we want to be able to work more efficiently. We need more up-to-date information from each other, etc. So hopefully thinking about the nature of this interdependence will then help you to choose which systems to adopt in your communication and which tools. The other thing you might want to consider, you know what, before we go into that, I'll just recap the principles of visible teamwork also, so you can start thinking about how it all fits together. So the task interdependence, we had pooled, sequential, reciprocal, and integrated. And the visible teamwork principles are deliberate communication, which are about the information about the person, where they're at. Work visibility, which is all about making the progress, conversations around the work and the work visible. And finally, planned spontaneity, which is more about building that sense of connection, but also just making sure that we can bump into each other, which might help us do our work. If we have these spontaneous interactions, that can often help. So another thing to consider then, and this credit goes back to Teresa about this, can you structure your task interdependence in a way that best suits the kind of interaction you want to have in your team? So how flexible is your work and your interdependence? Can you structure it so that it helps your team work better, more productively, more cohesively, so that there is more of a team spirit in the work? And things to bear in mind here are time zones. Clusters, so little groups that might be forming depending on location or even function. Is there a way of getting people who maybe could do with knowing more about each other? Can you get them working on a task together? Can you agree to do that? So I think there's a whole load to explore around that, around how task interdependence can help relationships in the team. Maybe then having more virtual coffees, we need to work more closely on tasks. Or finding the time to work on tasks closely together is proving difficult because of schedules. Well, is there a way of structuring the work so that it's more sequential and not as reciprocal? Anyway, only you know, listener, the kind of work you're doing and the interactions it involves. So if you need any help around this, then you know where we are, virtualnotdistant.com. And also you can email me, pilar@virtualnotdistant.com. The website has loads of resources. We also have Thinking Remote, which is a book, which is a collection of blog posts with some leadership reflection questions at the end. We have that book in Spanish now, Planteamientos del Liderazgo a Distancia, I think it's called. We have an online Meetings That Matter book, and of course there's going to be one out on visible teamwork. We have a monthly newsletter. And get in touch if you're interested about our coming program called Podcasting for Connection, which is an in-house podcasting to help you build community in your organization, regardless of where you are. As you can hear, my speech apparatus is becoming a bit tired. So I just want to thank you very much for listening. There's so many new podcasts in this space. So I'm just delighted that you've stayed here with us today. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, enjoy.